Chapter 1. It was one of those early spring mornings in St. Mildred's-on-Hatherley, when the village air smelt faintly of earth, of budding daffodils, and everything seemed too quiet to be entirely innocent. The village square was adorned with cheerful bunting, strung from the post office to the bakery, flapping gently in the breeze. It was the day of the spring jamboree and historical curiosities fair, an annual event of mild excitement and warm jam tarts. Tables had been set up outside the parish hall, covered in heirlooms, oddities, and family relics for a charity auction. Near the centre stood a glass display case containing the event's prized exhibit, an old sea captain's chest, supposedly belonging to one Admiral Geoffrey Chadwick, who'd lived and died in obscurity in the village nearly a century ago. And inside this battered old box, announced the vicar's wife with theatrical flourish, we have the famed Chadwick Journal, his seafaring account of treasure, mystery, and maps. She smiled with forced enthusiasm, eyes darting toward the mayor. Donated by the late Mr. Percival Fletcher, who passed just 3 weeks ago. God rest him. Miss Jane Marple, perched on a modest folding chair by the tea-stall, watched the proceedings with polite interest. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly at the mention of Percival Fletcher. His death had been noted in the Gazette as natural causes, complications from heart trouble, and there had been no reason to think otherwise. Until now. Around her, the village bustled with innocent pleasure. Children raced between stalls, waving paper flags. Elderly ladies discussed embroidery and digestion. Retired Colonel Blanchard blustered near the prize marrow display. But Miss Marple, clad in soft dove-grey, and observing everything without seeming to, sensed an undercurrent. Something about the atmosphere of excitement felt contrived. Beside her, young Ruby Ellis, the vicar's niece, leaned down. "Isn't it silly?" she whispered, adjusting her badge that read Volunteer Steward. "This whole treasure map nonsense. I mean, a hidden coup. Next, they'll be saying there's gold in a duck pond." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "It is rather whimsical, yes. But then," she added thoughtfully, "some truths hide best behind whimsy." Just then the town crier stepped forward, ringing his bell. "Hear ye, hear ye. The first bidding begins in 15 minutes. Place your silent auction slips at the red tent." The buzz grew louder. Someone nearby, was it Dr. Eltham, or perhaps Inspector Cray, made a jest about buried treasure, prompting a chorus of laughter. Then came the sound that silenced the square. A shriek. All heads turned toward the historical exhibit, where Mrs. Constance Hopgood stood frozen, hand to her mouth, eyes wide in horror. Miss Marple stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Perhaps," she murmured, "the treasure is not the only thing hidden today." Chapter 2. Mrs. Hopgood, who had once declared she hadn't dreamed since the Great War, was now trembling beside the open sea chest. A small crowd gathered quickly, gasping and murmuring. Inside the chest, on top of the faded journal pages and sea-worn relics, lay the body of Mr. Algy Barnes, the local antiques dealer, slumped awkwardly, eyes staring glassily upward. A folded scrap of parchment was clenched in his right hand. Miss Marple did not push forward. She remained at the edge, letting the crowd do what crowds always do: panic, speculate, embellish. Someone called for Dr. Eltham. Someone else, breathless, ran towards the village constable. Ruby Ellis muttered, "But Mr. Barnes was here only an hour ago. He said he was cataloguing the items for authenticity." Indeed. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. And did anyone see him leave the tent? No, but I assumed, Ruby faltered. Dr. Elton arrived, pushed past the onlookers, and knelt beside the body. After a moment, he stood and spoke with authority. Dead. Likely a heart attack. Perhaps the excitement or the fumes. It smells rather musty in there. Miss Marple sniffed discreetly. Musty, yes. But beneath that, something sharper. Acrid. A tragedy, murmured Mrs. Hopgood, who now seemed to enjoy being the centre of attention. He was always so particular with his gloves and polish. I never liked his eyebrows. Too sneaky. Was he clutching something? Asked Ruby, peering into the chest. A clue? No need for drama, young lady, said Inspector Cray, arriving with his usual blend of boredom and bluster. He took the parchment and unfolded it. Looks like a map, probably part of the fair's theme, staged for effect. Poor man must have taken it too seriously. Miss Marple stepped closer. Might I see? Cray sighed, but handed her the paper. It was indeed a map, crudely drawn on parchment, marked with faded lines and a large X in red. Unremarkable at first glance. But Miss Marple's eyes traced the ink, noting the inconsistencies in the grid, the faint initials PF in the corner. She did not speak. Not yet. The body was removed. The fair was quietly shut down. Tea stalls were folded, bunting taken down. But the villagers did not disperse. They stayed, clustered in knots, whispering. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting in her lap, listening to the low clatter of gossip echoing from passing. Pedestrians, heart attack, excitement, nothing suspicious except it was very suspicious. Miss Marple sipped her tea and looked toward the darkened lane. There had been no obvious wound, no sign of struggle. And yet, Algy Barnes had been a man with many enemies. Quiet enemies, business rivals, those he cheated, customers he overcharged, and, most notably, a recently feuding client, Charles Hargreaves, who had loudly accused Barnes of selling him a forgery disguised as a Georgian snuff-box. And then there was the oddity of Percival Fletcher's journal. Only recently donated. A man who died quietly weeks ago, also of heart trouble. 2 natural deaths. But in St. Mildred's, Miss Marple knew, nature rarely worked alone. Chapter 3. By morning, the banners had been taken down, the sea-chest locked away in the parish hall, and Algy Barnes's death declared a sad but natural misfortune by the Mildred Gazette. Most villagers accepted it with a shrug and a nod. People died, after all. But in the minds of the observant few, questions still whispered like wind through a hedge. The Reverend Julian Allerton, vicar of St. Mildred's parish, stood at the window of his study, frowning. Outside, Ruby Ellis gathered hymn books into a wicker basket while chatting with Mrs. Bowditch, the baker's wife. The vicar was not a suspicious man by nature, but recent events had stirred an unease he could not quite name. He turned as the door creaked open. "Tea," announced Miss Marple softly, carrying a delicate tray. "I thought you mightn't have taken any yet. It's lapsang souchong, your favourite, I believe." The vicar blinked. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful. Please, do come in." She poured without asking, handing him a cup. "I imagine you've had quite the morning. Poor Mr. Barnes, so unfortunate to pass in such a theatrical way." The vicar sighed and sat down. "Indeed, and troubling, Miss Marple. Not merely the death, though that was shocking enough, but the context of it all. The sea chest, the parchment, the journal of the late Mr. Fletcher. It all feels rather rehearsed." Miss Marple nodded. "Theatrical, yes. Not unlike a village pageant, where everyone plays their role, though the audience seldom knows who wrote the script." She sipped her tea. "You knew Mr. Fletcher well?" "Not intimately," the vicar said, adjusting his glasses. "He was private, reclusive even, attended services irregularly, but he was kind to the church, donated handsomely for the roof fund." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "he made no mention of this journal or the sea chest to you before his passing." "No," the vicar admitted. "The items were delivered posthumously, arranged through his solicitor. I found that curious." Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the shelf behind him, where leather-bound books and framed sketches lined the wall. "And what of his solicitor?" "Mr. Whittle of Granger and Whittle Inn, Lower Darkham. Efficient sort. He delivered the items with precise instructions. Said Mr. Fletcher wanted them used for the fair. Something about sharing a piece of history." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And no mention of a map?" "None at all." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the sound of a dog barking echoed distantly, and a cart rattled down the lane. The vicar cleared his throat. "May I confess something, Miss Marple?" "Of course." "I don't believe Algy Barnes died of natural causes." She looked up calmly. "Oh?" "He was here, in this very room, 3 days ago. He wanted to discuss the Chadwick Journal. Said it had oddities, that it wasn't as authentic as it appeared." "Oddities?" she asked gently. "He believed it had been altered. Pages missing, perhaps. He wouldn't say more, only that he was verifying something before the fair." Miss Marple set her teacup down with care. "Then he dies holding a map whose age appears fabricated, and no one can say where it came from." The vicar nodded grimly. "It all feels constructed, and I worry someone wanted that journal, or something within it, hidden." There was a knock at the door. Ruby Ellis peered in. "Vicar, Inspector Cray's here. He'd like a word." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Shall I slip away?" "Please don't," said the vicar. "You may hear something useful." Inspector Cray entered with his usual harried stride, and the scent of pipe smoke clinging to his coat. "Morning, Reverend Miss Marple." He gave her a tight nod. He'd long since learned that Miss Marple's presence, while unofficial, was never inconsequential. "I've had the map examined," he said, pulling out a folder. "Ink analysis suggests it's recent, months old, not centuries. The parchment's older, but repurposed." "Not Admiral Chadwick's hand, then?" murmured Miss Marple. "Hardly, which makes me wonder who planted it, and why. May I?" Miss Marple gestured to the folder. Cray hesitated, then passed it over. Inside was a photograph of the map, now flattened and enhanced. She studied it. "It's not nautical," she said after a moment. "See these notations? Well, elm tree, ash path. It's a local landscape, the village outskirts." The vicar leaned closer. "That's near the old quarry." Miss Marple nodded. "And here, the X is precisely where the ruined stables once stood on the Fletcher property." Inspector Cray frowned. "Why would Barnes be holding it?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "he wasn't holding it voluntarily. Perhaps he was made to." "Made to." Miss Marple looked down at the photograph. "Somebody went to great lengths to orchestrate yesterday's events. They created a spectacle, a false legend to draw attention away from something far less romantic. A secret," Cray muttered. "You think this is about the treasure?" "No," she said simply. "I think it's about a lie." Chapter 4 Later that afternoon, with the skies turning a gentle pewter, and the scent of damp grass rising from the hedgerows, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll through the village outskirts, toward the overgrown Fletcher estate. Once a fine Georgian manor, it had fallen into quiet decay after Percival Fletcher's reclusive final years. The main house now sat boarded up behind a rusted gate, its gardens surrendered to ivy and weeds. Miss Marple had often passed it on her walks, but today her step was more deliberate. The path marked on the forged map, Ash Path, Elm Tree Well, corresponded with this property. She paused beside a sagging stone wall as a blackbird darted from the undergrowth. A faint tapping echoed beyond the gate. She waited, not moving, and after a moment saw a figure crouched near the foundation of the ruined stables, Charles Hargreaves. He was prying at the ground with what looked like a metal fire poker. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. Charles startled upright, his tweed jacket smeared with soil. "Miss Marple, you, gave me quite a fright. Out for a stroll, are you?" She smiled mildly. "It's such a fine afternoon, isn't it? I often find it clears the head." His face twitched. "Right. Yes, lovely." Twitched. "Right. Yes, lovely." She stepped forward, hands clasped lightly. "It seems we've both taken an interest in this old place. So many stories, especially now, what with poor Mr. Barnes." Charles bristled slightly. "Tragic business, that, but not my affair." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, I heard Mr. Barnes sold you a rather questionable snuff-pocket last month." Charles's jaw tightened. "He tried to. I returned it." "Did he refund you?" Charles hesitated. "Eventually, after some pressure. It's no secret he peddled antiques of dubious merit." "Still," she mused, "for someone who believed there was no real treasure here, you seem very interested in what might be buried under this stable." His face flushed. "Are you accusing me of something?" "Not at all," she said calmly. "But if I were a man prone to digging holes in secret, I would at least wear gloves." He glanced at his hands, then muttered, "Good day," and marched off, poker in hand. Miss Marple waited until he was out of sight, then approached the disturbed patch of ground. Fresh earth. The edge of something metallic was just visible, no more than a corner. She made no attempt to unearth it. Instead, she turned back toward the village with the firm certainty that whatever Charles was looking for, someone else had already killed to keep it hidden. Back in the village, Ruby Ellis sat on the floor of the parish hall storage room, sorting through leftover decorations from the fair. She hummed faintly until her hand brushed against something beneath the bunting box. A velvet pouch. She blinked, opened it. Inside was a small silver medallion etched with a compass rose and the initials AC. Before she could examine further, a shadow fell across the doorway. "Busy, are we?" came the voice of Harold Pike, the fair's logistics coordinator. Ruby startled. "Oh, just tidying." Pike was a tall, bony man with sunken eyes and a habit of hovering too closely. "Found anything interesting?" Ruby hesitated, closing the pouch in her hand. "Nothing special." Pike stepped in, glancing around. "Odd, isn't it? All this fuss over a dead antiques dealer. Hart gave out, they say, though I never saw him run for anything." She offered a tight smile. "Yes, very odd." When Pike left, Ruby quickly slipped the pouch into her pocket. Something about it felt important. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor. "I know I shouldn't be here," Ruby said, breathless, "but look." She opened the pouch and placed the medallion on Miss Marple's table. The old detective turned it over gently between her fingers. A compass rose, and initials, a C. "Admiral Chadwick," Ruby offered. "Possibly." Miss Marple stood and retrieved a copy of the auction inventory. "Let's see. No mention of a medallion among the documented items. So it wasn't part of the display. No." Miss Marple peered at the design. "And this silver is not particularly old. Not naval standard, either. I wonder." She turned to her writing desk and retrieved a magnifying lens. Beneath the initials, in minute engraving, was a barely legible phrase. "The services rendered, 1952. Ruby frowned. "That's not from the Admiral's era." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "But someone went to great lengths to make it seem like it was." She looked up. "You found this in the parish hall?" Ruby nodded. "Under the decorations box." Miss Marple considered that. "Then someone either planted it or lost it. Either way, its presence contradicts the timeline." Ruby's eyes widened. "You think someone forged the entire Chadwick legend?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice low and sure, "that the legend was revived to cover something newer, something quite real. And someone was willing to kill Algy Barnes to protect it." She picked up the medallion again. "This isn't a clue to treasure. It's a clue to someone's past. A past they're desperate to keep hidden." Ruby whispered, "Then what happens now?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Now, dear, we observe quietly, because the next move will not be ours." Chapter 5. Rain swept softly across the windows of St. Mildred's the following morning. It wasn't the heavy, storming sort, but the gentle kind that made boots squelch and umbrellas bloom like black petals along the lanes. Miss Marple sat by her sitting-room window, watching the village move beneath the drizzle, her knitting untouched in her lap. The medallion still lay on the table beside her, wrapped in tissue. Its weight felt far heavier than silver. She heard the gate creak and saw a tall figure striding toward her cottage. He wore a long brown coat and walked with purpose. She rose and opened the door before he knocked. "Mr. Whittle," she said pleasantly, "do come in. I believe I was expecting you." The solicitor removed his hat, water dripping from its brim. "You were, of course. After all, you were responsible for Mr. Fletcher's estate, and when certain things do not quite line up, one naturally assumes the man with the keys may come knocking." Whittle managed a tight smile. "May I sit?" "Please." He took the offered chair, glanced briefly at the tea tray, but declined with a shake of his head. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I imagine you've come regarding the contents of the sea chest." "Yes," he said. "I've heard there's been discussion about authenticity, and young Mr. Barnes's unfortunate passing." "You delivered the chest yourself, did you not?" "I did. As per Mr. Fletcher's instructions, they were precise. He wanted it included in the charity event, along with the journal and whatever else the chest contained." "Did you examine the content yourself?" "No," he said. "I was instructed not to open it, merely to deliver." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Curious." Whittle cleared his throat. "I'll be frank, Miss Marple. The events of the past few days concern me. The forged map, the death, the rumors. I'm worried someone is trying to exploit Mr. Fletcher's legacy. Or worse, using it as a distraction." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "You're more astute than most would credit, Mr. Whittle." He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. Mr. Fletcher. He was not the kind of man to entertain legends. He was private, obsessively so. He made very few friends, but he confided in me now and then. About what? About his time overseas. About his time overseas. His naval contracts. Classified dealings during the early 1950s. He hinted at mistakes made. People he wanted to forget. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the medallion, still on the table, wrapped in tissue. Mr. Whittle followed her gaze. "What is that?" She unwrapped it slowly and placed it between them. He paled. "Good heavens, that's— Yes, that belonged to someone Fletcher served with. Algernon Crane. The initials match. They were close, though Fletcher never spoke in detail. Only once did he mention that Crane had disappeared under a cloud of scandal. Disappeared, Miss Marple repeated. Left the country, possibly under an assumed name. There were implications of bribery, smuggling, but nothing formal. Miss Marple sat back. And now a forged treasure map appears in Fletcher's chest. An antique dealer is killed holding it, and this— she tapped the medallion lightly— is found beneath decorations in the parish hall. Mr. Whittle spoke carefully. If someone is stirring up the past, Miss Marple, they may not care who gets hurt in the process. She gave him a long look. That is precisely what worries me. At the same time, in the back room of the Tipsy Stoat, the village's only public house, Charles Hargreaves sat hunched over a newspaper, glancing up nervously between sips of brandy. Harold Pike leaned in from across the table. "You're jumpy," Charles grunted. "You would be too, if someone you'd argued with dropped dead in a sea chest." Pike smirked. "Coincidence? No," Charles muttered. "Too convenient. And now people are sniffing around. That old woman, Marple, she saw me at the Fletcher place. I think she knows I was digging." "Then stop digging." Charles slammed the glass down. "I can't. I need it." Pike narrowed his eyes. "Need what?" Charles didn't answer. Instead, he rose abruptly. "Just watch yourself." After he left, Pike remained seated, tapping the rim of his glass with one long finger. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded page, the same crude map found in Barnes's hand. Only this one had an extra marking, an X, drawn in pencil, overlaid on the map's lower right. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the Reverend Allerton again. This time she brought the medallion and a list of names. "I believe," she said quietly, "that we're not merely dealing with a forgery or a village feud. I believe this is an echo of something much older and more deliberate." The vicar frowned. "Go on." She laid the names out. Percival Fletcher, Algernon Crane, Algy Barnes, Charles Hargreaves, Harold Pike. "All of them," she said, "are connected either by the supposed Chadwick journal or by proximity to the map, but one of them is missing a past." The vicar leaned closer. "You mean Pike?" "Precisely. He arrived in the village 3 years ago. No family, no record of prior residence, and yet he's insinuated himself into every community committee, including this fair." "And you think—" "I think Pike may not be Pike at all. I think he may be Crane, Algernon Crane, the man who vanished decades ago under suspicion." The vicar blinked. "You think he killed Algy Barnes?" "I think Barnes discovered the truth, perhaps recognized Crane from the past, perhaps threatened to reveal him. And that map, a red herring, something to lead the attention elsewhere." The vicar's voice was low. "What do we do?" Miss Marple's eyes glittered with calm determination. "We wait." carefully, and we give Mr. Pike a little rope. Chapter 6. By Thursday morning, the village of St. Mildred's had begun to shift uneasily beneath its veneer of calm. Rumours were spreading like ivy, quiet, persistent, and impossible to fully trace. In corners of the bakery, whispers mentioned Harold Pike. Others raised eyebrows at Charles Hargreaves's recent visits to the Fletcher property, and a few even suggested poor Algy Barnes had stumbled onto something dangerous, though no one dared say it outright. Miss Marple, as ever, observed rather than contributed. She was seated in the corner of the copper-kettle tea-room, a pot of weak Earl Grey before her, when Inspector Cray entered with an uncharacteristically brisk gait. He spotted her immediately. "Miss Marple," he said, pulling up a chair without asking. "It seems you've been busy." She smiled gently. "Only my usual habits, Inspector. Tea, knitting, observation." He gave a tight nod. "Well, I've come from Lower Darkham, visited Granger and Whittle, and—" Mr. Whittle confirmed most of what you suspected. Percival Fletcher did indeed serve with Algernon Crane, and according to an old naval record I pulled from archives, Crane disappeared in 1953, shortly after an investigation into smuggled military supplies. "How neatly that aligns with the date on the medallion," Miss Marple murmured. Cray leaned in. "Here's the interesting part. Fletcher had a sealed file in his will, accessible only upon suspicious death or proven forgery. That file mentions a man living under a false name in this village, but it doesn't say who." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Because Fletcher knew the name would be discovered, eventually." Cray watched her carefully. "You believe it's Pike?" "I do," she replied, "but belief is not proof." He exhaled, frustrated. "And you think he killed Barnes?" Barnes may have recognized Crane, perhaps through documents, perhaps from memory. I believe Pike feared exposure. Killing Barnes under the guise of a medical emergency allowed him to reclaim whatever evidence might exist. And that map, a distraction, an elaborate one. Cray ran a hand through his hair. "And Hargreaves?" Miss Marple's brow creased slightly. "I believe Charles Hargreaves is a desperate man, financially ruined most likely. He knew Barnes had found something valuable, or thought he had, and assumed there truly was treasure. That's why he was digging. But I don't believe he's a killer." Cray drummed his fingers against the table. "So what now?" "Now," she said calmly, "we let Mr. Pike speak for himself." That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Harold Pike to tea. He arrived promptly, too promptly, as though he'd been waiting for the summons. He brought a tin of shortbread and a slightly forced smile. "You keep a lovely garden," he said, glancing at the hydrangeas. Miss Marple ushered him into the parlour. "It's kind of you to say so. I find flowers to be far more truthful than people." He blinked at her, unsure how to respond. She poured tea. "No lemon, I'm afraid." "Milk's fine," Pike said. She handed him a cup. "You've been in St. Mildred's 3 years now. A comfortable village." "Yes, very," he sipped. "Quiet, pleasant." She nodded. "And before that—" He hesitated. "Up north, Lancashire." "Oh, really?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "My cousin was with the Women's Guild there. Rochdale. Did you ever pass through?" Pike blinked. "Once or twice, I think." She smiled kindly. "What a coincidence. I thought you said Durham last time." He went still. Miss Marple picked up her own cup. "Memory can be such a fickle thing, can't it?" He set his tea down. "Is there a reason for this conversation, Miss Marple?" "Oh, no," she said pleasantly. only that you were so involved in the fair. I found a few stray items and wondered if you could help return them, including this." She placed the medallion, wrapped in tissue, between them. Pike stared at it, then forced a chuckle. "Ah, some sort of novelty, I imagine." "Indeed. Curious engraving, though. Algernon Crane. You wouldn't know the name, would you?" His expression froze, just for half a breath. "Not long, but long enough." "I don't believe so," he said slowly. "Why?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Because it seems Mr. Fletcher knew him, served with him, and suspected he wasn't as gone as people believed." Pike stood abruptly. "Thank you for the tea. I've a meeting at the hall." He turned quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple called after him softly, "You shouldn't rush on damp days. That leg injury you carry must ache terribly in the cold." He paused at the door, not turning around. "Good day, Miss Marple." She watched him go, then murmured, "Algernon Crane broke that leg falling from a cargo truck. You'd know that pain better than most." That night, Ruby Ellis crept quietly into the parish hall with a torch. Miss Marple had asked her to look for any documents recently removed or added to the storage cupboard, particularly in the folder marked Historical Display Archive. It didn't take long. Behind a box of leftover bunting and placards, Ruby found a narrow envelope hidden in the sleeve of a ledger. Inside, 2 photographs, grainy, black and white, showing a group of uniformed men standing beside a cargo plane. One of them, unmistakably, was Harold Pike, or rather, Algernon Crane. On the back of the photo, 1952, Cyprus, C. Fletcher, A. Crane, M. Vale. Ruby stared at the images, heart pounding. Then she tucked them safely into her coat. Outside, someone watched from across the lane, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. At sunrise, Miss Marple received the photographs. She studied them quietly. "Thank you, Ruby. You've done splendidly." "What now?" Ruby asked. Miss Marple folded the envelope. "Now we wait. The man who thought he buried his past has just been reminded. Some things refuse to stay buried." Chapter 7. The next morning broke with a brittle chill, though the sun shone cheerfully enough to fool those not paying attention. Miss Marple, however, paid attention to everything. The lightness of the frost, the slight pause in the milkman's rounds, and the absence of Harold Pike's usual presence near the parish hall bulletin board. He was, it seemed, deliberately keeping out of sight. At midday she received a discreet visitor, Inspector Cray, who entered without fanfare and lowered his voice to match the hush of her cottage. "You were right," he said, placing a slim envelope on her writing table. "I've confirmed it through military records and Whittle's sealed file. Harold Pike is Algernon Crane." Miss Marple said nothing, merely poured him tea. "Anything else?" she asked. Crane nodded grimly. "Barnes sent a telegram 2 days before his death to a military archive request office. He asked for personnel files, Crane's name among them." "And did he receive a reply?" "Yes. A letter addressed to his shop arrived the morning of the fair. According to his assistant, Barnes locked it in his drawer before leaving for the event. I've just searched the premises. The drawer is still locked." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you haven't opened it yet?" "I was waiting on the warrant, but I brought a locksmith." She smiled. "Then I believe it's time we opened that drawer." Algy Barnes's antique shop, Timeless Treasures, was shuttered and still, but the air inside was tinged with polish and varnish, the scent of aged wood and secrets. Cray moved quickly, leading Miss Marple to the back office. The drawer in question was a heavy mahogany thing, fitted into a narrow roll-top desk. The locksmith worked in silence. With a soft click, the lock gave way. Inside were neatly arranged papers, a half-written invoice, and a manila envelope marked in Barnes's precise hand. Private. Archive request. Cray slit the envelope open. They unfolded the letter together. It was from the War Office Historical Records Division. A polite but revealing reply. To Mr. A. Barnes, your inquiry regarding Algernon Crane confirms his service record. He was under investigation in 1953 for illegal redistribution of military equipment, including high-value items intended for post-war museum contracts. Case closed after he disappeared en route to a court appearance. Declared missing. No death certificate issued. There was a second sheet, an image of an old personnel photo. Crane stood at the end of a line of officers, hands clasped behind his back, his face younger but undeniably Pike's. Cray exhaled slowly. So Barnes knew. And someone knew that he knew. Miss Marple traced the edge of the paper. And the medallion. A commendation for exemplary service before the investigation began. A reward, perhaps, or hush money. Either way, it connects him to the official record. Cray closed the drawer. It's enough to detain him. Not yet, said Miss Marple quietly. Cray blinked. Not yet. No, she said, rising. Not until we understand why Barnes was killed when he was. Pike had lived here 3 years. Why murder now? What changed? Back at the vicarage, Ruby Ellis sorted hymnals under the watchful eye of Mrs. Bowditch, who had taken a sudden and fervent interest in church cleanliness. When Miss Marple arrived, Ruby was sent to make tea. Once they were alone, Miss Marple said softly, Ruby, I believe you were followed the night you retrieved those photographs. Ruby's cheeks flushed. I didn't notice. No, dear, I don't blame you. I didn't notice. No, dear, I don't blame you. But someone saw you enter that hall, and that someone may now suspect what you found. Ruby swallowed hard. Do you think he'll do something? Miss Marple met her gaze. I think Pike is cornered, and cornered men are dangerous. That's why I must ask you to help me spring a final trap. Ruby blinked. Me? Yes, you know the hall. You're trusted by everyone, and you're clever. Ruby straightened. What do I have to do? Miss Marple reached into her handbag and removed a folded slip of parchment, an exact replica of the fake treasure map. Put this, she said, inside Pike's ledger. Say you found it where the original was displayed. Let him believe it was accidentally swapped. Ruby's eyes widened. You want him to react? Precisely. He must believe the past he buried is beginning to resurface, faster than he can silence it. At twilight, Ruby followed instructions precisely. She placed the map fragment into Pike's ledger, carefully positioned so that it would fall free when the cover opened. She ensured the lights were on, that someone might pass by and glimpse her tidying. She even whistled as she left. 30 minutes later, Pike entered the hall. He found the map. He turned pale. Then he did something unexpected. He opened the safe behind the dais. Unbeknownst to him, Miss Marple and Cray watched from the vestry door. Pike removed a folder. Cray whispered, What's in that? Miss Marple replied, Something he couldn't destroy. Something tying him directly toward Barnes uncovered. Cray stepped forward, quietly but firmly. Mr. Pike. Pike froze. Or should I say, Mr. Crane? The man turned slowly, folder still in hand. He didn't run. He didn't protest. He simply said, I suppose I always knew it would end like this." Miss Marple stepped forward. "You were running from your past, but it caught up the moment you entered the fair, when you saw what Fletcher had left behind." He smiled sadly. "I thought I had years more." "You did," she replied, "until Algy Barnes recognized you." Pike nodded. "He wanted money. Said he'd tell the papers. I panicked. It wasn't planned. I just snipped something in his tea. That damned chest gave me the perfect cover." Cray moved to cuff him. "You're under arrest for the murder of Algy Barnes and obstruction of historical inquiry." Pike's expression remained strangely calm. "You don't know what people are capable of, Inspector. I did worse things in service, but that was just fear." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. It always is. Chapter 8. With Harold Pike, alias Algernon Crane, now in custody, a sombre calm returned to St. Mildred's. The villagers, of course, gossiped ceaselessly. How Pike had kept a false name. How he'd killed Algy Barnes to protect some wartime scandal. And whether the rumoured treasure had ever truly existed. But for Miss Marple, the matter was not yet finished. Because something still didn't sit right. The murder had been explained. Crane's motive, his hidden identity, Barnes's discovery, the fear of exposure, was logical. But Miss Marple's instincts whispered of something more, something quieter. A second current beneath the surface. On Sunday afternoon she invited Mr. Whittle, the solicitor, for tea once more. "I suppose it's all resolved now," he said, folding his napkin. "Remarkable, really. How long a man can live under an alias." Miss Marple poured his tea and stirred her own thoughtfully. "And yet, something troubles me." "Oh? Mr. Fletcher's chest was delivered to the fair on your instruction, yes?" He nodded. "That's correct, just as Fletcher specified." But the map, the one found in Barnes's hand, was not in the chest, nor included in the inventory. "No," Whittle said. "I assumed it was granted afterward, by Crane." Miss Marple set her spoon down. "And what if it wasn't?" Whittle frowned. "Miss Marple, what if the map wasn't meant to mislead, but to reveal something Crane didn't anticipate?" She rose and walked to her bookshelf, retrieving the original copy of the Chadwick Journal, now returned to her after the investigation. She flipped carefully through its brittle pages until she reached the one that had drawn her attention days earlier. A passage describing a cipher. Fletcher, it seemed, had copied a fictional treasure map from the journal, but had inserted subtle differences into the drawing delivered at the fair. The grid lines were slightly off. A few landmarks were reversed. It wasn't a mistake. It was a code. Fletcher wasn't hiding a real treasure, Miss Marple said quietly. He was hiding information, and he left it in plain sight. Later that evening, she visited the vicarage. Reverend Allerton studied the altered map alongside her. "So these marks, they're not positions." "No," she said, "they're initials, hidden within the landscape shapes. Letters spelled out through the positioning of paths, trees, and ruins." The vicar traced the pattern. W-A-L-T. "Walter," Miss Marple finished. "Walter Vale." The vicar sat back slowly. "My word, that name! I haven't heard it in years. He used to serve with the church choir. Left suddenly. Some said he'd stolen funds." Miss Marple's tone was calm. "He didn't. He disappeared the same year Crane arrived. And, most importantly, he worked with Fletcher's solicitor's office, part-time." "You believe Fletcher confided something in him?" "No," she said. "I believe Vale found something in Fletcher's papers, something tied to Crane, and I believe he was silenced for it." The vicar's expression darkened. "Another death?" Miss Marple nodded. "Only it wasn't ruled one. He was said to have moved abroad. No forwarding address." The next morning, Miss Marple visited the archives in Lower Darkham. With careful politeness and the borrowed authority of Inspector Cray's name, she requested the public death notices and emigration records from 1953. There was no official record of Walter Vale leaving the country, but there was a small news item from that year. Local clerk presumed drowned in Quarry Pond. Body never recovered. Miss Marple closed the file slowly. The Quarry Pond, the one adjacent to the Fletcher estate, the same location where Charles Hargreaves had been digging. By late afternoon, she returned to the village and paid a call on Charles Hargreaves. He looked tired, older than he had weeks ago, as though the weight of suspicion had pressed upon his spine. "Miss Marple," he said cautiously, "I don't know what else I can say. I didn't kill anyone." "I don't think you did," she said gently. He blinked. "But I do think you found something that frightened you." He didn't answer. "You were digging at the Fletcher estate. Not for treasure, for something else." He exhaled shakily. "It was a boot?" Miss Marple nodded. "Go on." "I dug around the old stables, and something caught on my spade. Leather. I pulled and found just the boot. Nothing more. But the heel had a faint set of initials inside. W.V. I panicked. Buried it again, I thought. Maybe someone else had already found the rest. You should have come to the police." "I couldn't. Not after Barnes died. Everyone thought I was guilty. I thought if I said anything, they'd pin it on me." Miss Marple's voice was kind. "Charles, you must take me to where you found it." That evening, under a sky dimmed by thick clouds, Charles led Miss Marple and Inspector Cray to the Fletcher estate. The overgrowth crackled beneath their boots as they crossed to the old stables. "There," Charles whispered, "just beneath the broken stone trough." Cray and his constable began to dig. Within minutes they unearthed the decayed remains of a canvas satchel. Inside, rotted cloth, bits of leather, and a few brittle pages wrapped in oilskin. A wallet, long soaked and hardened with time. Cray gently opened it. Inside was a faded ID card. "Walter Vale." Miss Marple closed her eyes. "He never left. He was buried here, all along." Cray's voice was solemn. "You believe Crane killed him too?" "No," she said softly. "I believe Fletcher did." Cray turned sharply. "Fletcher?" She nodded. Vale discovered something in Fletcher's documents, likely about Crane's past. He may have confronted Fletcher, intending to go public, but Fletcher, loyal to his old friend, or fearful of his own wartime involvement, panicked. Perhaps they struggled. Perhaps it wasn't deliberate. But Vale died. Cray was silent. Miss Marple continued. "Fletcher spent the rest of his life haunted, and when he knew he was dying, he built this elaborate setup, not to expose Crane, but to entrap him. A final confession hidden within theatre. The chest, the journal, the map. Fletcher wanted justice, but not through courts. He wanted a reckoning, and so he laid bait." Cray looked down at the satchel. "He set it all in motion, even from the grave." Miss Marple gave a tired sigh. "Even the dead cannot always stay buried." Chapter 9. 3 days passed. The news of Walter Vale's remains sent quiet shock waves through St. Mildred's. The villagers didn't speak of it openly, out of decency perhaps, but you could hear the shift in their voices, the stutter in conversations, the sudden hush when someone said quarry. The spring air had taken on a weight, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Harold Pike, now revealed as Algernon Crane, remained in custody in Lower Darkham. Inspector Cray was working with the War Office to compile a formal file, one that would span decades and 2 forgotten deaths. But Miss Marple knew something still lingered. She sat by her fireplace, knitting in her lap, when the Reverend Allerton arrived, cap in hand, face drawn. "I've been thinking," he said after she poured his tea, "about Fletcher, about guilt." "As have I," said Miss Marple, placing a sugar cube delicately in her cup. "He was a solitary man. Guilt often makes one so." The vicar reached into his coat pocket and drew out a slim, leather-bound Bible. "This was left in the choir loft. I didn't notice it at first. It was tucked behind the hymnals. It has Fletcher's name inside the front cover." Miss Marple's eyes flicked upward. "Curious. There's more." He opened the Bible and carefully pulled free a folded note. She took it gently and unfolded the yellowing page. "To whom it may concern, if you find this, then my efforts have succeeded, though at what cost, I cannot guess. I never meant for anyone to die, not Walter, not Algy, but silence was never safety. Algernon's secrets poisoned more than his own soul. I tried to atone the only way I could, by planting a trail he could not resist, and by letting the truth dig itself free. Forgive me, I was never brave, but at least I was thorough. P.F. Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "Now it's complete," she said. The vicar watched her. "You believe Fletcher truly meant for Crane to expose himself?" "Yes," she said. "He created a stage. The journal, the chest, the legend, all designed to awaken Crane's paranoia. Barnes's death was an unintended consequence, a tragedy, but one Fletcher couldn't have foreseen. And Vale," Miss Marple looked down at her tea, "that was a sin Fletcher tried to bury, and then resurrect." The following day, Inspector Cray called a private meeting at the parish hall. Inside were only 4 people: Cray, Miss Marple, Mr. Whittle the solicitor, and Ruby Ellis, who, despite her nerves, had proven herself essential throughout. Cray laid out everything they had gathered: Fletcher's sealed instructions, the photograph of Algernon Crane, the military record, the forged map, and now the Bible note, a confession disguised as reflection. Ruby sat quietly, hands clasped, until she asked the question none of them had yet dared voice aloud: "Will Crane be charged with Vale's death?" Cray shook his head slowly. "There's no forensic evidence, no witnesses, just a recovered boot and a circumstantial timeline. The death was ruled an accident 70 years ago." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. "And Fletcher?" Whittle spoke softly. "He's dead. There's no justice left to give." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple said, "Perhaps not justice, but understanding." She turned to Ruby. "Do you still have the second medallion?" Ruby blinked. "Yes, it's in my drawer." "Then I believe we should return it to its proper place, quietly. No announcements. Some things deserve burial, Ruby, not to hide them, but to forgive them." On Friday afternoon, beneath a grey and blinking sky, Miss Marple walked alone to the ruined stables. She knelt in the patch of earth where Walter Vale had been buried, and gently pressed the medallion into the soil. "There," she whispered, "you were not forgotten after all." A robin landed nearby, hopping once, then vanishing into the hedgerow. Vanishing into the hedgerow. Miss Marple stood, brushed the soil from her gloves, and turned back toward the lane. Later that evening, as the church bell chimed softly in the distance, she sat once more in her parlour, the fireplace flickering, a shawl draped loosely across her shoulders. The mystery had been solved. But unlike others, this one didn't end with a dramatic confrontation or the satisfying clang of courtroom justice. It ended in layers of regret, of buried truth, of long-ago choices finally surfacing. She thought of Algy Barnes, of Walter Vale, of Fletcher and the guilt that consumed him, of Ruby, who had stepped into danger with courage, and even of Algernon Crane, a man who tried to erase himself, only to be found by the one thing he underestimated, memory. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again. As the needles clicked softly together, she said aloud, to no one in particular, "People believe secrets fade with time, but time doesn't erase anything. It just buries it deeper." Then she smiled faintly and kept knitting. Chapter 10. A week later, St. Mildred's resumed its rhythm. Gardeners pruning hedges, children chasing marbles down the lanes, and church bells ringing at their appointed hours. But beneath the return to routine, a faint echo remained. The memory of a forged map, a vanished clerk, and a man who wore another's name for decades. Most villagers were content to let the matter rest. But Miss Marple was not. She had sensed it ever since the Bible note, a subtle thread left hanging. It wasn't the facts of the case. Those had all been confirmed. It was a feeling, quiet but insistent, that something was still missing. That afternoon she visited Mr. Whittle again, this time unannounced. He received her with his usual courteous professionalism, though his eyes looked slightly tired. Perhaps, she thought, the weight of long-buried secrets had left its mark on him too. "I wonder," she said as they sat before the fireplace, "if Mr. Fletcher ever mentioned another name to you. Someone outside the obvious chain of events." Whittle frowned. "Another name? Yes, not Algernon Crane, not Walter Vale, but perhaps someone peripheral. An assistant, perhaps, or someone present during the years following the war, who had reason to remain forgotten." Whittle rubbed his chin. "There was someone, briefly. A man named Maurice Vinton. He worked with Fletcher in the early 1950s, handled some of the offshore property contracts. Very discreet, left abruptly." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes. Fletcher said he'd taken up a post overseas. Never heard from again. Why?" She folded her hands. "Maurice Vinton's initials are M.V. He appears in the photograph Ruby recovered from Barnes's safe. Cyprus, 1952. He stood beside Fletcher and Crane." Whittle's face tightened. "And there's something else," Miss Marple continued softly. "The medallion Ruby found. The second one, wrapped in velvet. It bore the initials A.C., but etched beneath, barely visible, but two more letters. M.V. Whittle's breath caught. "You think? I believe Maurice Vinton wasn't a clerk. I believe he was the originator of the smuggling plan. That Fletcher and Crane, though complicit, were secondary. And I believe Vinton returned to England under a new name." She looked him in the eye. "Your name, Mr. Whittle." The solicitor was still for a long time. Only the fire crackled between them. Then, quietly, he said, "I didn't kill anyone." "No," Miss Marple replied. "I don't believe you did. But I believe you buried the truth to protect yourself, and Fletcher helped you, for a time." He nodded once, slow and resigned. "Fletcher promised it would all fade, that as long as we stayed invisible, no one would dig. And for decades, No one did. Until he began to fade himself, Miss Marple said. Until his guilt demanded a reckoning. I never asked him to plant the chest, Whittle said. I told him it would be a mistake, that stirring the past would only bring ruin. And it did, Miss Marple murmured, but only for those who kept running from it. She rose. I have no interest in seeing you punished, Mr. Whittle. Not for what happened 70 years ago. But I do expect you to do something about it now. He looked up. Such as? Restore Walter Gale's name, quietly, officially. Ensure his death is remembered as a tragedy, not a disappearance. And see that any proceeds from the Chadwick Journal auction are donated anonymously to the restoration of the Quarry Memorial. Whittle gave a soft, bitter laugh. You're a formidable woman, Miss Marple. She gave a faint smile, only persistent. I've lived long enough to know that the truth rarely knocks loudly. It scratches gently until one is forced to open the door. That evening she sat once more with Ruby Ellis, who had come by with a lemon sponge, and a nervous energy she couldn't quite disguise. So it's all finished? Ruby asked. Miss Marple nodded. It is. Even Mr. Whittle. Yes. Some people make mistakes they spend their lives trying to outrun. He'll make amends now. Not out of fear, but understanding. Ruby set down her plate. Do you ever get tired of it? Tired? Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. The secrets, the lies, the endless peeling back of masks, doesn't it ever weigh on you? Miss Marple's expression softened. Sometimes. But every truth uncovered is one less shadow cast. That's enough for me. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint sound of rain tapping at the window. Then Ruby said, You never did answer one thing. What's that? She leaned in. Do you think there ever really was a treasure? Miss Marple smiled. Oh yes, she said, but not of gold or jewels. The real treasure was the truth, hidden, denied, and finally unearthed. Ruby looked thoughtful, then smiled back. That's not very exciting. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it is very necessary. And with that, she returned to her knitting as the final storm passed over St. Mildred's, leaving behind clean air, clear skies, and just the faintest scent of closure. Chapter 11. Sunday morning dawned bright and unseasonably warm, casting a golden light over St. Mildred's village green. The spring fair bunting had long been taken down, replaced by fluttering white banners for the Easter charity auction, a far less ambitious affair than the ill-fated historical curiosities display. Miss Marple sat near the rear of the parish hall, quietly observing the bustle of the villagers setting up tables. Her eyes moved without urgency, noting gestures, nods, absences. Charles Hargreaves was conspicuously missing, though that came as no surprise. The poor man had withdrawn almost entirely from village affairs since the discovery at the Fletcher estate. Ruby Ellis, however, was there, folding flyers and chatting with Mrs. Bowditch. Her smile was easier now, lighter. She'd come through fire, Miss Marple thought, and come through well. Miss Marple, came Inspector Cray's voice, as he appeared beside her with a cup of tea. I wasn't sure I'd see you here. She accepted the cup gratefully. It seemed only right to attend. Closure often needs ceremony, however small. Cray nodded. We've wrapped the Crane investigation officially. The War Office has chosen not to pursue extradition on historical charges. With Barnes's death ruled a murder, Crane will stand trial for that alone. And Mr. Whittle, Miss Marple asked mildly. Still the solicitor of record, Cray said, lowering his voice. "But I've heard he's been discreetly funneling funds into memorial efforts. Quietly, of course. Quite." They drank in silence for a moment. Then Cray said, "It was rather a web, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Most things are, if one's willing to see the threads." He gave a rueful smile. "It's a shame most police work deals only with scissors." After the service, Ruby caught up with Miss Marple outside the churchyard, where the daffodils bloomed in gentle yellow waves. "I've been thinking about Walter Vale," Ruby said softly. "He was lost so long, and no one ever asked." Miss Marple paused by the stone wall, looking toward the distant trees. Because he was quiet, because people assumed his absence was his choice. But it wasn't. "No," Miss Marple said, "and yet silence has a way of becoming permanent, unless someone listens for it." Ruby looked down. "I never thought I'd be involved in something like this." Miss Marple smiled. "Nor did I, when I was your age. But observation is a quiet inheritance. You have it." Ruby blinked. "You mean I could do what you do?" "If you learn to watch before you speak," Miss Marple said, "and if you always ask what is not being said as well as what is." Ruby straightened, cheeks pinkening slightly. "I'd like to try." Miss Marple gave her a gentle nod. "Then begin with the post office queue. That always yields something useful." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple tidied away the last of her notes. The Chatwood Journal had been returned to the parish's archives, now fully catalogued, minus the theatrical embellishments. The medallion had been placed in a display case next to Walter Vale's name, a small brass plaque beneath it reading, "In memory of the forgotten." She sat before the hearth with her knitting, her mind still sifting the remnants of the case. Some mysteries unravelled in shouts, others dissolved in whispers. The treasure, as it turned out, had never been treasure at all, but it had been real. The truth, so long buried, had found its way to light through journals, gestures, and a forged map drawn with more gilt than ink. Outside, the village was quiet, peaceful. But Miss Marple knew better than to believe in permanent stillness. That evening, as dusk settled, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Charles Hargreaves standing on her stoop, hat in hand, eyes hollow but honest. "I needed to say thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not accusing me when the rest of the village was ready to. For seeing past what I couldn't explain." Miss Marple gestured him in. "Come in, Mr. Hargreaves. The kettle's just boiled." He hesitated, then stepped inside. Over tea, he spoke softly of debts, shame, and the terrible weight of being suspected, even silently, of something one did not do. "I really thought there was treasure," he said, voice raw, "and I was desperate enough to believe it." Miss Marple stirred her tea. The true treasure was never buried. It simply waited for the right eyes. He looked up. "And those eyes were yours?" "No," she said. "They were Barnes's first. Mine merely followed the trail he started." They sat a while longer. No more confessions necessary. When he left, the moon was high and pale, and the world, for once, felt settled. Chapter 12. The day after Charles Hargreaves's quiet visit, Miss Marple received a parcel in the post, plain, wrapped in brown paper, and marked only with a familiar law officer's seal. Inside, nestled within tissue, was a slim ledger, bound in dark green leather, and a folded note on cream stationery. "Dear Miss Marple, per your request, enclosed is the notarized amendment to the Fletcher file, signed by myself and lodged with the Darkham Archive." Walter Vale's disappearance is now listed as an unsolved suspicious death, not a voluntary departure. A formal apology has also been submitted to the village council on behalf of the estate. I suspect this is not the end, but it is, I hope, enough. Yours, Maurice Vinton, formerly Whittle. Miss Marple traced the signature with a gloved fingertip. He had not run. That was something. She opened the ledger. Inside were detailed notes Fletcher had kept, far more meticulous than anyone had realized. Names, coded references to shipments, even letters addressed to M.V. The evidence was now complete. A case built not on confession or confrontation, but on quiet paper trails. She closed the book and placed it beside the medallion plaque on her shelf, beside a framed photograph of her late nephew Raymond and his wife Joan. The moment felt like punctuation, firm, final, and long overdue. Later that week, Miss Marple took the train to Lower Darkham to attend Algernon Crane's preliminary hearing. It was a grey day, the sky muffled with low clouds, and the courthouse was nearly empty, except for a few pressmen and Ruby Ellis, who had insisted on accompanying her. Crane looked older than he had weeks ago. The mask had dropped. The smooth, ingratiating facade of Harold Pike was gone, leaving behind a thin-lipped man whose eyes avoided the light. The charges read aloud were straightforward. Murder of Algy Barnes by intentional poisoning, fraudulent identity assumption, and interference with an historical investigation. The defense made no plea. Crane stood, spine ramrod straight, and said only, "I regret nothing but being discovered." Ruby leaned, only, "I regret nothing but being discovered." Ruby leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, "He doesn't even seem sorry." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Some men regret only the consequences, never the cause." The judge ordered remand and a full trial to be set in June. As they exited the courtroom, the sky opened briefly into pale sunlight, casting long bars of gold across the courthouse steps. Ruby paused halfway down. "Miss Marple, do you think Fletcher meant for it all to end this way? Barnes dead, Vale discovered, Crane exposed." "I think," Miss Marple replied, "Fletcher knew that guilt cannot bury itself forever. He wasn't seeking vengeance, Ruby. He was setting the clock right, slowly." Ruby looked down. "And it cost lives." Miss Marple nodded. "Most reckonings do." 2 days later, the village gathered for a modest ceremony at the Quarry Garden. There, beside a small refurbished plaque for Admiral Chadwick and the History Fair sponsors, now stood a new stone marker. "In memory of Walter Vale. Died 1953. A man lost to silence, found through truth." Miss Marple stood a few paces back from the crowd. No speeches were made, just quiet laying of daffodils, by those who remembered or pretended to. Charles Hargreaves was present, standing at the edge, hat in hand. Ruby read aloud a single line from Scripture, then stepped aside, allowing the silence to speak for itself. And in that silence, Miss Marple felt the circle close. The map, the chest, the names, the deaths, all accounted for. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple prepared a letter to Raymond. "Dearest Raymond, I have just concluded one of the more peculiar inquiries I've encountered. Less a puzzle of murder than one of memory and guilt. It involved a forged treasure map, an old naval scandal, and a man who buried the wrong person in every possible way. You once asked me why I find these things so compelling. I think it's because, in every crime, there's a wound left open, not just for the dead, but for the living. and sometimes only by stitching it closed with truth can anyone heal. Please do write back soon. Joan's marmalade cake recipe is still proving a local legend. With fondest affection, Aunt Jane. She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and placed it on the tray for the next day's post. Then, with a small sigh, she sat back down to her knitting. Outside the breeze turned gentle. St. Mildred's at last was quiet again. But Miss Marple, ever listening, knew that peace was never permanent, only earned. Chapter 13. Spring deepened in St. Mildred's, and with it came the scent of new blossoms, fresh earth, and a sense of things finally settling. The trees along the main road filled in with leaves, dappling the cobbled pavements with green shadows. The bakery once again sold out of seed cake by mid-morning, and the post office queue returned to its usual fuss over misplaced parcels and weather predictions. But beneath the rhythms of everyday life, something had changed. People paused a little longer when passing the quarry path. The pub was quieter in the evenings, and there were fewer dismissive glances when the name Walter Vale was mentioned, if only because they'd now learned what silence could cost. Miss Marple, for her part, welcomed the return to ordinary days. She had resumed her regular walking schedule, making polite calls to the garden club ladies, commenting on early roses and potato blight, and knitting steadily through her afternoons. Yet, even as the village resumed its calm, she knew something subtle had shifted. Truth had a way of doing that, leaving invisible marks even after the paper trail was closed. One morning, she received a visitor. Ruby Ellis, in a pale yellow cardigan, appeared at her gate with a small notebook and a hopeful look. "I've been keeping notes," she said once they were seated, "on village goings-on, just in case anything, odd turns up." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That is an excellent habit and idea. I thought perhaps I might help you next time, not just by fetching things or sneaking into cupboards, but really help." Miss Marple regarded her for a moment. "Then tell me," she said, "what did you observe yesterday at the grocer's?" Ruby hesitated, then sat straighter. "Mrs. Bowditch bought 2 tins of salmon, but said she was hosting only 1 guest. Mr. Hargreaves dropped his change, but didn't stop to retrieve it. He seemed distracted. And Mr. Eltham, who never buys marmalade, bought 2 jars of it." Miss Marple beamed. "Excellent. 3 points of interest, 1 inconsistency, 1 behavioral shift, and 1 anomaly." Ruby flushed with pride. "Do you think I'll be any good?" Miss Marple picked up her teacup. "With time and care, yes. Observation is a matter of patience, and more importantly, kindness. One must never seek scandal, only understanding." Ruby nodded. "Then I'll keep watching." That Sunday the vicar delivered a brief, graceful sermon on remembrance. No mention of recent events, no direct references. But everyone understood. After the service, the village gathered in the courtyard, as the vicar, with quiet dignity, unveiled a new wooden bench by the lilac tree. A brass plate shone in the spring light. "In quiet memory," for those who went unheard, but not unseen. Charles Hargreaves was there, seated at the edge, speaking in low tones with Mrs. Bowditch. Even Harold Pike, now awaiting formal trial, had sent a letter from prison, read aloud by the Reverend, with the words, "What I took in fear, I return in truth." It was brief. It was enough. That evening, Miss Marple wrote again to Raymond. "Dearest Raymond, you'll be pleased to know that things in St. Mildred's are once again peaceful, though not, I hope, forgetful. We have new lilacs blooming, and a bench where once there was only ivy. Young Ruby has taken to recording village behaviour with the diligence of a budding chronicler. And even Charles Hargreaves has offered to help restore the old records from the fair. It's strange, isn't it, how much truth hides beneath the day-to-day? And stranger still, how rarely people wish to look for it. But sometimes, if you sit very still and wait, the truth finds you. All it asks is that you listen. Your affectionate aunt, Jane Knight, settled gently over the village. At her window, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, eyes lifted toward the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to prick through one by one. Old stories, she thought, eventually come to their end. But the listening never does.